Hi, I'm Mike Henry, and this is my Procreate 4.3 demo for the piece I call Son of Mogh. So, if you don't know, this is Worf, the Klingon from Star Trek The Next Generation. It was a show I used to watch a ton when I was younger, and I've actually been meaning to do a rewatch, but when I was going through my photos, I found this old drawing of him that I had done that I always wanted to color. In fact, somewhere on a hard drive, I think I have two versions of this where it's like flatted in Photoshop, and I just never took it further than that. So this was kind of like a long time coming, and I could finally actually sit down and put some paints on this. Since one of the things I've been doing a lot with Procreate is revisiting old things that I always wished to color, this just seemed like a perfect candidate for that. Now, I don't exactly know why, but when I started this, I kind of had a vibe for the piece that I knew I wanted to try and hit. It was kind of like this late 60s, early 70s painting vibe. I don't know that I completely hit it, but that is sort of the reason why the background is the color that it is, and I apply a bit of a paint texture, not paint texture in the brush, but like I do like a texture over the entire thing that makes it look like it got like a gloss paint over it or something. And I think I got there at least where I wanted it to be in my mind. So there was something about Worf where I was like, that's gonna work really well. At least I feel like it does. I feel like it fits Worf, which makes no sense because he's from the future, right? But it was just kind of the vibe I wanted to go for. So that's where we end up eventually taking it. As for the rest of the painting, the sort of technical aspects of this painting, it's all done in the turpentine brush in Procreate, and you'll see very quickly here, it's really clear what my layers are. In fact, you can figure it out quickly, I think, even if you're just breaking them down yourself. We've got his sort of face forehead skin, we've got his neck skin. Those are on two separate layers. The neck is under the face. You can see here by the way that I'm cutting out the hair so precisely, that means that the hair is below the face skin. And I'm going to be doing that on all of the hair across. And that gives me some flexibility with that hair that's in the background there, where basically the hair can all just share one layer together, which is really nice. So then there's his collar and shirt and his like sash thing that he has, and then eyes and eyebrows. And so when this is all done being flatted, it's going to be like back collar in the back, front collar, which is then the rest of his uniform with the orange part of his uniform, then on top of that, the sash on top of that. The neck will go between the back collar and the rest of the uniform, then the hair, and then the face skin, and then the eyes, interior eye details, and then eyebrows. So it's really simple, and then the background is more or less just a painterly treatment to give it some sort of a texture back there. You can see now that I'm laying in that neck, you can see exactly where that neck is in relation to the face layer. I've received questions in the past about using the fill tool. Some people don't even know there is a fill tool, and others wonder why I don't use it in certain circumstances. So I just want to quickly explain that. The fill tool, for those who don't know, it is kind of hidden. It's not a specific tool that you select, but you grab the little paint dot in the top right of your UI, where the dot is that shows what color your current paint is, and you just drag it into your canvas. You can either drag it with your finger or the pencil, and then wherever you drop it is where it fills. One thing to note is that when you pull it and drag it to your canvas, you can hold your finger there for a second and it will fill the space that you have defined, and then you can stroke your finger left and right to get it to basically to adjust its tolerance. So it'll either fill in more, it'll fill in less, which it'll respect the sort of anti-alias pixels more or less. And that's really helpful when you're dealing with something that's more of like trying to fill in something that's sketchy versus trying to fill in something that is a solid line. Now, I never use this when I'm doing the turpentine brush, and that's because I want the turpentine brush as a brush to basically have its texture and have its errors. Something I've spoken about in the past is I try to seek too much perfection when I'm doing flats and certain types of painting. Again, not that I achieve perfection, but like it keeps me rigid because I'm trying to get like this right smoothness, or I'm trying to keep something sharp or whatever it is. And the turpentine brush, because of the nature of it, it is messy, and so I try to keep that messiness, and that is even in how thorough the fills are. So if you were to color shift sort of these background layers, you would be able to see through a lot of areas of my fill, because I actually want some of that to happen. I want some of that chaos and some of those errors to be in there. It's the same reason why you might want the edge of a field to have some sort of damage to it. That's the same reason why the interior is the same way. So if I were to do a fill, not only would it probably be kind of annoying and it wouldn't really fill thoroughly, like all the way to the edge, and I would have to go in and clean that up, it would also rob me of the chance of having these sort of interior errors. So now here we're wrapping up the eyebrows, and you can also see some of those errors here. Now the one thing that I wanted to make sure was clean was the points on the end of his eyebrows. I went kind of crazy with his eyebrows when I did the original drawing because I just thought it would look cool, make him look a little bit more alien too. And now here, just doing the eyes. You'll see when I fill in the iris, I keep it kind of soft, and that's just me trying to keep it a little painterly and try to find little moments to keep things kind of just interesting, just trying to find fun moments throughout the entire thing. Here we got the skin slightly darker, and then put in the little eye meat in the corner of the eye. And then we'll get the eyelashes in here just to make sure that the definition on the eye is clear. That can be done with lighting as well, but I mean we all have eyelashes, but I think in a style like mine, I use the eyelashes to make sure those eyes really pop. And I just realized now that I misspoke when I was saying the layer stack before. I had forgot that I did this because I don't often do this, but I carved out the neck to make space for the uniform. So the actual entirety of the uniform is on a layer underneath the neck. So just to revise my layer stack for a second, because I didn't review it before I started recording, the uniform and all of its components are on the furthest back or furthest down, depending on how you think about your layers of the entire stack. So they are all the way in the back or all the way at the bottom. And then now that I've got that dark one laid in there, I'll put in the orange for, you know, just those details of his suit, how it's got that bottom part that's they've all got the bottom parts that are different colors for different ranks and stuff. Actually, I don't know, is it for different ranks? I just realized I don't know that. I could look it up and then not sound like an idiot on the video, but instead I'm gonna leave it. So now here's the texture I was talking about to add sort of a glossiness. I just used one of the hair brushes and vertically stroked up and down with white to get that look like it's been brushed on, and then I fill it all in black and then merge those two together so that I get the darks and the lights, and then that'll be set to an overlay with a really low opacity at the end of the piece. But I just kind of wanted to experiment with it there because I knew that's where I eventually wanted to take everything. So our shadow layer, that's me just, you see me doing a bunch of scribbles and stuff, that's me just understanding exactly what I want to do with it, see how my flats are playing with that shadow. And now I'm working on the actual shadows using the color that I've decided on. You can see there I turn off the black from his uniform for a minute because it was too hard to see. I want to get all those details right, and I know that it's going to be a lot easier for somebody to actually stare at those details and see if they're right than it's going to be for me to pick up on them while I'm painting it. So I'm doing this just so that I'm dealing with values that are a little bit clearer. Now we move on to the neck. So we're moving up through our layer stack, doing select paint, select clear. That is linked down below if you want to know what select paint, select clear is. For those who've watched these videos like a million times, this time I will not describe it. Please click on the link below if you don't know what it is. I'm trying to spare people who've seen these a lot just once me not explaining that. So now we've moved from the neck to the hair, because if you remember, the face is all cut out so the hair is behind the face. So we just put in our ambient occlusion pass for the hair. And now we've moved on to the face and we're doing it on the face. One thing that I want to point out is depending on I guess it's really my mood sometimes. It's not really anything more than that. You'll see that I don't do things like the blush under the nose or the darkness around the eyes, or if I want to colorize lips or 5 o'clock shadow or whatever it is, until I'm done with these shadow layers, because the shadow layers are going to define that geometry, and I don't know exactly where I'm going to want some of that. So for instance, if I put the blush in now on his nose so that I can bring color variation to his face, that nose might end up getting defined differently when I'm actually doing the shadow layer. So I try to save it now so that I do the shadow layer and then I go back in later and apply those types of skin variations. So you'll see that come in later is what I'm saying. So here's an example of me starting to define the nose. So we're adding some of that extra shadow around the nose, around the eyes, and just trying to bring definition into the geometry of the face here. We're using that same light brown red that we've used everywhere else. It's set to multiply, and it's a layer that sits on top of everything else, so that it's consistent throughout the entire piece. We'll use in this case, I believe we use the exact same color, but you can always tweak it slightly depending on your needs. Use the same color for the direct light shadow that gets cast across him, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. Right now, my point here in what I'm doing is I'm trying to softly define all of the geometry of the face, and that way we'll have that sort of base form that we then will lay the rest of our light and shadow across. Now, as time has gone on, my usage of the turpentine brush has gotten better. I feel like I have more command over it. Sometimes I feel like that's actually a bad thing, because it means I can bend it a little bit more to my will, which means happy accidents become fewer. However, what you're seeing here a lot is a lot of smudging now. I'm using the smudge tool a lot more, but I'm trying to still preserve turpentine brush. So when I'm working on one of these, my turpentine brush is my brush, my eraser, and my smudge tool. And when I'm trying to do these ambient occlusion passes, I use the smudge tool a lot to soften everything, and then I don't use it much at all for the direct light shadow. And then what I will sometimes use it for on the direct light shadow is if I do need to round out a form, but all of the cast shadows remain hard. So now we'll just move in on the eye so we can get a close-up of the eye. I use the shadow in this case to define the pupil. Usually I keep the pupil like its own layer, but here I just wanted to keep everything kind of soft, which is why I used that. So we have the base ambient occlusion pass for everything at this point, and we're moving into the direct shadows. We're going to start with the collar and the uniform, just like we did before, because we're going to do select paint, select clear, and move up through the stack again. This time though, we're thinking differently about our shadow. Now we have our shadow placed in the top right of the piece, and it's casting everything across, so you can see his hair is casting hard shadows, his chin is casting hard shadow onto his neck, and everything is getting cast onto his uniform as well. And we're going to just make sure that we're keeping that consistent. That's something that I don't talk about much, but it's something that I brought up when I was doing the critique video, is keeping your shadows consistent is incredibly important. Now, saying something like keeping your shadows consistent is important is actually kind of a generic way. It's really only one component of the entirety of thinking about the lighting of whatever you're working on. Really, it's not about just keeping your lighting consistent, because that's kind of a general statement. It's about saying you have to imagine that what you're working on is a virtual object, and you have to, or a real object. It's virtual, but you have to imagine that it's an object, and you have to imagine where the light is in that scene, and you have to try and simulate in your head and then on the page where the light is hitting, what kind of shadows are being created by that, and how every material is reacting to that light. You can do that through reference, you can do that through just approximation, you can also do that through a combination of the two, or I don't know, maybe there's other methods, but basically there's observing the real world and you sort of bank away that information and try to replicate it later, or you just look at that information and do it directly. But that's what you're doing. And all of these tricks, especially like if you look at something that's like really cartoony, where maybe there's just a one shadow layer, what that's trying to do is through limited means, it's trying to replicate the same thing. And as something gets more and more and more and more realistic, you have to start taking on techniques that directly replicate something that's in the real world. What you see here is certainly not realistic. This is more of the banking away information and attempting to replicate it later. This is me trying to make educated choices based off of my observations in the past. And by combining several of these shadow and light techniques, I'm trying to replicate something that at the very least makes you think of something that's realistically lit. And so the reason why I just went on that whole ramble there was to say that the simple act of saying keep your lighting consistent, keep your shadows going the same way, that is a really sort of straightforward, simplified way of saying it. But what I'm really trying to say, or what people who say that are really trying to say, is you have an object here that you're trying to bring to life and make completely 3D, or at least as much as possible. And you need to keep in mind, where is that light? What is each material? How is everything reacting? Every shadow that gets cast across your subject is helping define the shapes of that subject. You can either have a shadow off of a nose cast all the way across its face and all the way down to the shirt, and then it makes that nose look really big and prominent, or you can have it just cast a little bitty shadow, which now tells the viewer that that nose is shorter, or that lighting is less severe, or whatever it is. The ultimate point here is try to think of what you're doing, what you're painting, as being as three-dimensional as possible. Use reference if you have to make sure that you're understanding that, and try to look at how all those materials react and how the lighting reacts. And that, if you're thinking about it that way, I think that you have a chance of getting everything to look more tangible and more dimensional than if you were to just be thinking, oh, there's a light source here, so all the shadows go that way. Because that's certainly a step to get there, but that's a more simplistic way of thinking about it. Now, the stage that we're at here is I've got my ambient occlusion pass, I've got my direct lighting pass, and now I'm putting in skin variation in his skin. I don't really do that in the hair, so this is something I do on basically every character. I try to find opportunities to get that skin variation going. I looked at some pictures of Worf, and things like blush showing through on his nose, or even, his lips kind of, his eyes a little more so, but he's so covered in makeup that a lot of that doesn't really happen. And a lot of that doesn't happen in the real world anyways, as much as we try to replicate it in paintings. It's more just because it helps bring some life to the skin and the character as a whole. So we try to push that more. That said, one thing that is never visible on Worf is like 5 o'clock shadow, or at least not any reference that I could find. So even though that's a fun thing and it can really help sell, especially skin on men, because it makes their face just look that much more towards something that we're all familiar seeing, this like real representation, I decided to leave it off. It's sort of a trick I love using, but unfortunately couldn't really use it here. So we've got a little bit of pink in the lips, we've got darkening around the eyes, and then I decided to make his nose actually darker than it really ever is, because I kind of liked the idea of taking Worf a little more animalistic. He's not like, like a beast character of any kind, like he's not like a half animal or whatever, but I kind of liked that vibe that it was giving him, so I wanted to keep going with that. So you could say that this is kind of like not Klingon, this is kind of like a Worf portrait, but then it's also got a little bit of reimagining going in there, but only a very little amount. Right now you can see those highlights on his hair. They're very hot, and so that makes his hair look a little plasticky. We're going to knock those back to try and, I mean, it's still stylized hair, but we don't want it to look super crazy shiny. We're going to be using blue as our highlight layer, and it's just basically lowered in opacity, and that's what we're going to use everywhere. So as you've seen me do in the past, I'm going to paint that in, and I'm a little wild with it because I'm just sort of trying to capture some of the form and where the light's coming from, and then I will use my direct light layer to select and clear away from that highlight layer, just to make sure that those highlights aren't getting into the shadows at all. So here we are, just moving through all of the layers, making sure all of the highlights are in. Now just throwing in a reflection on the eye. I want to zoom in for that really quickly. And that will also get that really hot spotlight on it, but eventually that's on some layers in the very, very top. Now we'll just wrap up some of those highlights, and then I'll zoom in for a second just for a quick adjustment to the eye. See right here, just adding that edge of the eyelid right there. And some reflection from his skin onto his eyeball, which is just lowered in opacity there. A little bit of darkness in the nostril to really punch up that nostril. Same thing with the mouth, get the space in between the lips a little bit more defined. Now we move out and start working on the background. This is still turpentine brush, just keeping it messy, following the flow of the character, adding a little bit of visual interest there, but nothing too distracting. And then we've got this rim light, which is super bright, super hot, but that was sort of the point of it, just to define that dark side in a very extreme way. By doing that, by adding that rim light and then having the rest of them sort of neutrally lit like that, well, it's not neutral in the sense that there is a direction to the lighting, but it's also at the same time not overly dramatic. Having this rim light makes it look more like he's in a photo shoot having his portrait taken, so it's going back to that original look that I wanted for this entire piece. when I do black hair, I take it like sort of a blue, maybe like a blue-green, but here I realized, like I looked at a bunch of pictures of Worf and he's usually very warm colored even in his hair, so that's here where you see that flip where it suddenly is brown, and now we've brought this whole thing into like a much warmer overall vibe. There's really nothing keeping it away from a warm feel, except for the fact that we're using a blue highlight. Or blue lighting, I guess I wouldn't really call it a highlight, but anyways, which is kind of nice because that brings us even more into the paintings from the era that I was talking about trying to replicate, where everything sort of felt overly warm, or at the very least it's aged warm, which is kind of interesting. But that's sort of the last major adjustment now. What we're going to do last throughout this piece is some extra lighting touches. We're going to put a little bit of darkness on the distant side of his head, just to push that depth and that darkness on the left side where the light's not coming from a little bit more. And then we're going to put a couple of cast shadows across him, like the light is coming through a space of some sort, just to bring a little bit of focus to him and his expression. But then also, of course, having this big ass cast shadow across him helps push some of his dimension and keeps the image looking a little bit more interesting. This is done with the same shadow, although a little desaturated than what I had used for all the other shadows in the piece, as another layer on top. I can't really say all the layers, I can't really name all of them, but basically what you've got here is you've got a bunch of flats, and then on top of it you have a bunch of modifying layers, which are all shadows and rim lights and highlights and lighting, and then additional shadows, and that can all basically be toggled on and off in one folder and take it from something that is just flats to something that's a little bit more interesting. And now with just some last minute color adjustments, that's the final piece. I warmed it up quite a bit in the very end, brought a little bit more red into it, and just really tried to nail that vibe that I was going for. And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed my sort of redesign and painting of Worf. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I will see you on the next video. And if you are looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.